Okay, colleagues, we're going to resume. Before I turn the floor over to Mr. Cooper to resume his debate on the motion, I just want to point out that as members, we have the luxury of being able to kind of stand up and walk around and talk in the hall if we need to. Not all of the staff from the House administration have the privilege of doing that. They have to stay in their seats and be attentive to what's happening. So the health break is in part for them as well. And I think it's important that we are mindful of the fact that it's not just members in the room, but others as well. So this will be something that is not uncommon if we end up in long periods of time without breaks. But with that, Mr. Cooper, the floor resumes for you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And what we're seeing this morning is part of what we have seen for the past year and a half on this committee, which is obstruction by the Liberals to thwart the ability of this committee to get to the bottom of failures on the part of this Liberal government with respect to foreign interference that has attacked our democracy, our elections, and interference that has targeted our colleagues, whether it be Mr. Chong or the 18 members who we now know were the subject of a cyber attack. And it is what we see from these Liberals is they say they're very concerned about this. They even went along with giving unanimous consent to send this over to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. And all I wanted to do this morning was to, in light of that, have this committee get to work to schedule hearings. And what did the Liberals with the NDP do when they have an opportunity to do that? Suddenly it's not a priority. Suddenly it's all about themselves again. That they want to make it a priority about themselves, not the failure that occurred, the breach of the privileges of other colleagues, and to see that there is accountability, because there needs to be accountability. We need to know who it is that we're aware of the information that had been provided by the FBI to the communications security establishment, and why those members, following that information being provided, were kept in the dark, and why it took a foreign government and an unsealed indictment from the U.S. Justice Department and a report in the Globe and Mail for this to come to light. The Prime Minister famously said that sunshine is the best disinfectant. But when it comes to Beijing's interference in our democracy and in our sovereignty, this Prime Minister's record has been one of being anything but transparent. Canadians deserve better, and frankly, our colleagues, all of us, deserve better insofar as this could happen to any one of us. And for all we know, one or more of us have been the subject of these types of attacks and kept in the dark. And in order to address that broader concern, we need to get to the bottom of what happened in this particular instance involving these 18 MPs. So I will have more to say, Mr. Chair, so I'd ask to be put to the bottom of the list, but I will leave it at that for now as I look forward to the comments of my other colleagues.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Colleagues, again, I did this the other day because there's been some time that has passed since we last talked about the list. I'll just remind colleagues of where we're at. It will be Mr. Duncan, followed by Monsieur Berthold, Calkins, Matheson, and Cooper again. Mr. Duncan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to take an opportunity to build on what my colleague, Mr. Cooper, said. We are increasingly seeing, not just in the House, but in several committees, including multiple times here at the House and Procedural Affairs Committee, a record that the NDP has, frankly, of saying one thing, and when it comes to a vote, doing the opposite. I want to read into the record. Actually, I want to give a bit of a background of what's happened so far today. Mr. Cooper gave a notice of motion regarding the question of privilege that was just passed within the last about hour or so now from the House of Commons, being referred to PROC to study another question of privilege around the issue of foreign interference, this time not just on one specific member, but 18 members of Parliament from many different political parties that were affected by the issue. Mr. Cooper asked to adjourn the debate that we're currently undertaking. The sub-amendment that Mr. Cooper has on the amendment of Ms. Matheson about Ms. Romanato's main motion. Seems like the NDP complained to say that would defeat the motion. For those Canadians that are watching, adjourning debate on a motion does not defeat it. It puts it back in the proverbial parking lot and allows another issue to come forward, particularly the notice of motion that Mr. Cooper has that the House was just seized with for several hours this morning and last night. The NDP refused to adjourn the debate to allow discussion about the question of privilege and to move forward on that study. Let's make it very clear what happened there. I want to take a moment. I've got the transcripts from last night, particularly, of what the NDP was saying in the floor of the House of Commons about the priority and importance of moving forward with this question of privilege and a study on it. The Speaker took the floor last night about 8:20 p.m. and ruled on the question of privilege raised on April 29th, 2024 by the member from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan. Fast forward of different colleagues in the chamber making comments. And it was the NDP House Leader, Mr. Julian, on one of his first interventions, and I will read into the record what the NDP said in the House of Commons. I always listen attentively to my colleague. I think in this case it is very, very clear, as we've seen with Justice Hoag's preliminary report, which points to very clearly to some things. There is a real shortcoming in terms of how the government and past governments have dealt with the information around foreign interference. We've seen repeatedly from the 2019 and 2021 election that information was not communicated to candidates. In this case, addressed in the question of privilege, information was not communicated to members of Parliament. There's a lack of protocols and a lack of organization, not necessarily around the obtaining of information, but in actually communicating that information to people who might be impacted. This may be members of Parliament, or as we saw in election campaigns, candidates. We need to ensure that actions taken to prevent further interference of this type. Go on. Mr. Julian get up a little bit later. Quote from Mr. Julian, the NDP House Leader, and it's the NDP Deputy House Leader that sits on this committee. But Mr. Julian said last night, Mr. Speaker, quote, Mr. Speaker, I would like to begin by saying that we see this matter, this question of privilege, and the motion before the House of Commons as important. We will therefore support this motion so that it can be adopted as quickly as possible in this whole matter. This question of privilege can be referred to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs as quickly as possible. Okay. Then Mr. Julian says a few minutes later, I believe it's an exchange of a back and forth, but in questions and comments, quote, there is systematic pattern of the government erring in how it potentially gets information to candidates during an election or to members of Parliament. That needs to change. That is why we need to refer this to the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs to come up with protocols and suggestions for actions, unquote. Just last night. In response to the Bloc Québécois and questions and comments, Mr. Julian of the NDP said the following, quote, Mr. Speaker, I thank my colleague for the question. It is precisely for that reason that the NDP moved the motion that led to the public inquiry. Further on, we believe, quote, we believe that we should act in the national interest and think first about how we do everything we can do to prevent foreign interference in our politics, in our democracy, in our elections. He goes on to further state, there are many things we can do, and it starts tonight with referring the motion to the Standing Committee on House and Procedural Affairs. Then Mr. Lamoureux gets up and asks a question or comment. Mr. Julian of the NDP responds, and I'll say, quote, that is why I suggest to all members tonight that we need to refer this to PROC promptly and not to take a day or two to talk about it. The time for talk is over. It needs to be referred to PROC for action. That, coupled with the Hogue Inquiry, or Hogue Commission, hopefully gives us all the things we need to put in place to fully protect our democracy in any future election. Goes on again. In response to an exchange with Mrs. Kuzi, he asks her a question, quote, Mr. Speaker, would the honourable member agree with me that this needs to be referred promptly this evening to Procedure and House Affairs to come up with recommendations? Not done yet. There's more. Mr. Julian had a lot to say, a lot of passion about PROC taking this up and beginning deliberations and recommendations and study into this question of privilege. Actually, Ms. Ashton took the floor of the NDP last night a couple of times. I'm going to quote what she said. NDP said this last night in the floor of the House of Commons when the effort to bring forward Mr. Cooper's motion to get the ball rolling, the NDP blocked it. But here's what Ms. Ashton said last night in the House of Commons. Quote, Mr. Speaker, given the severity of issues like this, would the member agree that sending the matter to PROC, it is obviously the body that is best equipped to deal with it. Would the member agree that it should be sent to PROC as soon as possible? Ms. Ashton took the floor a little while later. Quote, Mr. Speaker, it is clear that this issue merits proper examination. At this hour, we've heard from many speakers that this must be taken seriously. Will the member agree that this should be referred to PROC as soon as possible? Obviously, we gathered here to debate C-59, which has issues of great importance to the citizens we represent. Will the member agree to, here's her words again, this is continuing the quote, to speeding up the process and moving this to PROC as soon as possible? Ms. Ashton took the floor again last night. Member of the NDP. It's unbelievable, their advocacy, their passion on the floor of the House of Commons. Ms. Ashton says, quote, would it not be in all of our interest to have this dealt with by PROC as soon as possible? Will the member agree to send this matter to PROC as soon as possible so we can actually move on this? And it goes on. Ms. Kwan from the NDP spoke this morning very passionately in the House. The motion was unanimously adopted. Referred to here, Mr. Cooper tabled the notice of motion, attempted to have that brought forward, and it was blocked. So, Mr. Chair, I, at the beginning of my comments, confirmed to alleviate the concern of Ms. Matheson that adjourning the debate we are currently undertaking does not defeat it, but what it would allow to do, as Mr. Julian, as Ms. Ashton, many members, Ms. Kwan, many members of the NDP have said numerous times in recent days that this should be the issue as soon as possible to be dealt with at PROC and by PROC. The motion was defeated, so we cannot discuss how we move forward and study this important question of privilege. So if the NDP truly says one thing in the floor of the House of Commons, and they have a record of they say one thing, they talk tough, they're all challenging, and they're frustrated with the Liberal record of all of this. And then they vote a completely different way, siding to cover up and block with the Liberals many times. So now that I've clarified that we are adjourning so we can bring up the issue that were there, Mr. Chair, now we have that all clarified. Now that we have into the record several members of the NDP on record in the House last night when the cameras were on and people were watching, talking about this. The cameras are still on here. I move to adjourn debate in order for Mr. Cooper's motion to be brought up, please. Move to adjourn. I move to adjourn debate.
Okay. Mr. Duncan, can you please repeat and clarify for our
To
benefit?
adjourn to the debate.
Okay, so colleagues, we know how this goes. We are going to vote on this immediately. This is the same vote that we held a little while back. The question is whether or not we are going to adjourn debate on Ms. Romanato's motion. Mr. Clerk, I will ask that you call the vote.
Monsieur Lauzon.
No.
Madame Fortier.
No.
Mr. Duguid.
No.
Monsieur Drouin.
Eric?
No.
You want to keep the floor?
Ms. Romanato.
No.
Cooper.
Yes?
Mr. Culkins.
Yeah.
Mr. Duncan.
Yes.
Monsieur Berthold.
Oui.
Madame Gaudreau.
Oui?
Ms. Matheson.
No.
5
Okay.
yeas, 6 nays.
Colleagues, we have 5 yeas and 6 nays, so the debate continues. Mr. Duncan, should you wish, the floor remains yours.
I've got another quote from the NDP last night. If I could continue with that. We just saw the NDP block for a second time, despite what they said in the floor of the House of Commons, despite all of the things as soon as possible that this needs to be discussed and move forward on. They're blocking the opportunity to move forward, specifically on the question of privilege that was unanimously just passed on the floor of the House of Commons with support by the NDP. It was their whip, Miss McPherson, that was raised on the NDP whip's intervention on the question of privilege. Quote, Mr. Speaker, I would like to comment on the point of privilege that was brought forward earlier today by the member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan. The New Democratic Party is very concerned about the recent news that members of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China could have been or were the targets of cyber attacks from hackers who were linked to Beijing. I'm a member of IPAC and I'm deeply concerned because I do not know the details. I do not have the information I need to know whether my personal emails were hacked or whether there were cyber attacks made against me, other members of the New Democratic Party, or indeed any member of this House. I'm concerned this information came forward from the U.S. government, and our government did not provide that information to legislators. I'm concerned because this is not the first time I have felt that the government has withheld information from members of Parliament from legislators. I think back as well to a time when the House, when members of the Subcommittee on International Rights were called out and sanctioned by the Chinese government. As a member of that committee, I found all of this out on Twitter. There was no support provided to me as a parliamentarian by the government, and I find that unacceptable. I also find it unacceptable that it seems we are repeatedly having to ask the government of the day to provide the information to parliamentarians that they need to do their work. We do not know what the government of Canada knows. We do not know when they knew it, and we do not know why it did not alert those members who may have been impacted by this work. And then she wraps up here to say, actually, legislators need to have this information. They need to be able to feel they are protected. They need to be able to feel they are safe doing their work. And lastly, she says here, quote, I do believe this constitutes a violation of parliamentarians' privilege, and it is vitally important that we get to the bottom of it. So vitally important, so as quickly as possible, pass it now so it can go to PROC, Mr. Chair, that we had the NDP align with the Liberals to block it twice. And to clarify, Mr. Cooper had a notice of motion, a great notice of motion, a great motion in itself that talks about a scope of how we can address the question of privilege. And the NDP blocked it from even being discussed. That tells you everything you need to know about the NDP. The Liberals, we know, they want to cover up. It makes them extremely uncomfortable to have to talk about the issue and their record of foreign interference. Because there are many, many examples of them covering up and not providing information. I literally just read quotes of the NDP within the last 24 hours complaining about the exact same thing. And twice now, the NDP, despite the House Leader in the House of Commons advocating for PROC to take this up as quickly as possible, at the first opportunity that comes up, they block it twice. This is ridiculous. The committee needs to move forward on this discussion, this question of privilege, this issue of foreign interference. This should be the issue, the number one priority that PROC deals with right now. Mr. Chair, I'll have more to say and ask to be added to the bottom of the list, but I know Mr. Boutreau, my colleague, has some comments to say as well.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Duncan. You are correct, Monsieur Berthold. I think I got it right this time. À vous, monsieur.
Félicitations, Monsieur le Président. Je pense que vous avez effectivement.
Congratulations, Mr. Chair. I think you're, no doubt, you've had to work very hard to pronounce my name correctly, and I thank you for that. Mr. Chair, it's my turn to take the floor. I'm a bit surprised to see how events are unfolding this morning, Mr. Chair, especially that we haven't given all of the parties to take an opportunity to take a break so that we could discuss the agenda of the committee's business in the next few days. And twice since the beginning of today's meeting, there was a proposal to defer the debate on Mrs. Romano's motion. What does this mean? Well, in the end, we've sidelined it, and the idea is, can we come back to this? And it's usually not something that conservatives like to do. When you adjourn debate, they don't usually like that because they're not a majority around the table in the committee. You can't bring back the debate because ever you want to bring a debate that was adjourned at our initiative, one has to have a majority of members who will agree to resume debate. So that is the situation we find ourselves in. Conservatives don't like this. But at this point, what we are seeing is that the adjournment of debate has been refused by those who hold a majority here around the table. This debate could be brought to a vote as soon as a member of the government or of the NDP takes the floor and tables a motion asking that we resume the debate, and that would be it. So, Mr. Chair, when we're speaking about how important it is to take the floor, again, I know I'm being quite wordy, but I've just begun. This is just the beginning. Mr. Bertot?
And you've indicated you may talk for a little bit more. Colleagues, out of respect to your schedules and your schedulers, because I know that things move quickly, I do want you to know, because it seems as though there's still a fair amount for us to work through as a committee, I have asked for resources, and we've been granted resources to continue till 2 o'clock. So I'm interrupting Monsieur Berthold just right now so that you have a chance to plan your schedules between when we were supposed to end the meeting at 1 o'clock. We will continue until 2, and then we'll reevaluate where we're at 2 o'clock. So with that, Monsieur Berthold, la parole est encore avec vous.
Monsieur Berthold, vous avez encore la parole. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's very kind to warn us that we will have an opportunity to speak until 2 p.m., but I would prefer not to do that. Mr. Chair, what I would prefer is that we come to a common sense solution. That is, we adjourn debate on this motion so that we can take advantage of the time we have in order to discuss the next steps and that we can begin the study which was requested by the House of Commons following the issue of privilege, involving 18 of our colleagues who were the victims of an IT attack from a foreign power. I'd like us to do that and that we do not take up these resources uselessly from the House until 2 p.m. But it seems that the NDP, despite everything that was said in the House yesterday, does not want to do this. And that worries me a great deal because we heard statements, and I was listening this morning to Jenny Kwan's speech. It was truly a very well thought through speech about the fact that she and others were victims of foreign interference through the hacking of their email accounts. And to her mind, it was blatantly obvious that as quickly as possible, we would need to focus on this motion of privilege to PROC. But Nikki Ashton, who's part of the NDP caucus from the Churchill Kewanaski riding, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, who stated by putting a question to Mr. Faison, my questions, and I'll read that question now. Mr. Chair, given the seriousness of this issue, would the member accept to refer this issue to the Procedures Committee? It's the NDP who put in that request last night during the debate. So clearly, this is the best body to address the issue, and would the member agree that this question would be referred to the Procedures Committee as soon as possible, Mr. Speaker? As soon as possible. So we were given this opportunity as soon as the House of Commons unanimously adopted this motion. That is, the Conservatives did this. The Bloc also voted for this motion to refer this to the PROC. NDP also voted in favor of the motion to bring the issue of privilege back to the PROC. Independent MPs as well voted in favor. Everybody agreed that PROC quickly study this issue because it is such an important issue. So we were given the opportunity to do this. Now, unfortunately, and I don't know for whichever reason, whether it be political, partisan, or others, we don't quite know why. Mr. Chairman, the Liberals are refusing to adjourn the debate so that we can move to this important debate, this issue. And what's even more surprising is that the NDP is also refusing this. They're refusing to adjourn the debate, to set it aside for 2 minutes, so that we can speak to our calendar to see how we work things out over the next few weeks, how do we organize our witnesses, and how we're going to proceed. So as quickly as possible, we can then address the issue of privilege. And as I mentioned, Mr. Chair, the NDP that proposed an amendment to the Liberals' amendment can at any time, as soon as I take the floor at any time, bring back debate on Ms. Romanado's motion. Why? Because they have the numbers on their sides. I know numbers and the Liberals don't always work well together, but that's a whole other story, and I'm going to not start another debate because, again, you could call me to order for that, for all kinds of reasons. This said, however, Mr. Chairman, the numbers are all telling, and we could come quickly back to the debate. If one day, let's say, we don't have any witnesses or the witnesses to speak to the issue of privilege are not there, we have many opportunities before us, enabling us to move forward and to do what is right and important both for the House of Commons, which has asked this committee to, as quickly as possible, commence study on the issue of privilege, and as well regarding other topics that the members of this committee would like to address and that are absolutely reasonable. We're not against the motion tabled by the Liberals. Well, perhaps we could move some amendments to the content. We might have some amendments to make as to how this will be brought forward. We don't disagree, but we would be prepared to begin the study. But in the meantime, Mr. Chair, since Tuesday, when we had the decision by the Speaker of the House of Commons, who recognized the relevance of the issue of privilege that was raised by Sherwood Park, Mr. Garnaccinis in Saskatchewan. We spent the whole evening debating it. All of the parliamentarians that I heard and those that I listened to agreed that this was an issue of importance, that is the interference of the Beijing regime in our system, in our parliament, in our election systems. Everybody wants PROC to study this as quickly as possible. It is up to the members of this committee to see how to do this as best as possible, at what pace, and which witnesses we'd like to hear, and how we will proceed. I cannot understand, simply don't see why the Liberals wish to prevent this at this time. Truly, I don't follow. Because when you're in the House, everybody agrees, and then we're here in order to specifically address this issue and to debate. Then we have a government NDP Liberal coalition that decides to vote against us. So that is a fact. And it really is an important issue. The question before us is important. Through the FBI, we learned that Canadian members of parliament were the targets of Chinese IT hacking in 2021. Just imagine. And it is not the FBI that communicated with us. We learned it through the newspapers because the newspapers found out through the FBI that parliamentarians in the House were the target of Chinese computer hacking in 2021. It seems to me that somebody in Canada had been notified. Somebody in Canada, either from the government or somebody from the House of Commons, must have been informed, and that is why we need to conduct a study to identify who received that information, who was notified, and when. And as we saw with Mr. Chong regarding the study we've just completed, that was another question of privilege. The members were the last to find out. This is completely unacceptable. That MPs, that elected representatives from their different ridings across the country, because they spoke to such an important issue like foreign interference, or that they decided to defend individuals from diaspora, whether this be the Chinese diaspora or the Ukrainians, regardless of whom, that because they decided to speak out on behalf of citizens who live here in Canada, that they are the target of foreign interference, that IT hacking, as was the case raised by Mr. Garnaccinis, who was very shocked to learn in the newspapers that there had been this IT hacking attempt. Was there damage done? We don't know. What were the effects? We don't know. Has information been disclosed? We're told there wasn't any. I don't know because nobody has told me. And I think that it behooves the committee to get to the bottom of things, to ask the right questions to the right people, to get clarity on this issue, and to ensure that Canadian parliamentarians are not the target of these cyber attacks from a foreign power, and if so, that they be made aware of it, and that they are kept in the dark when this works in somebody else's interest, but that they find out as soon as it happens. Because we saw in the foreign interference file that the decision to inform the political parties or the MPs was not done by CSIS or RCMP. This was a group of individuals who had to assess the information that they had received, and they came together and said, oh, well, maybe that might be it, or no, that doesn't quite reach the level of importance that we had set, so we won't notify immediately. As a result, we all learned after the fact. We saw this. And Madam Justice's Hogue report that we received last week was also clear regarding the entire process that needs to be reviewed. And I believe that the PROC committee, just as my colleague said so correctly, and I think had met 70 times to speak about foreign interference, which illustrates how important this was for the committee. It also illustrates how important foreign interference has been for the members of the committee. A number of the members have been here since the beginning. Some came, others left, because with 70 meetings, that's a great deal of meetings. But we can't stop there, because foreign interference has not stopped. If miraculous, we were to say, yes, Commissioner Hogue, and we had her, and by appointing her with a magic wand, suddenly all of foreign powers would say, including China, would say, oh, Canadians have appointed a commissioner, we have to stop everything. We have to stop doing foreign interference. And that didn't happen. And it won't happen. And that's why it's important for us to better protect it. The government needs to make the right decisions. And that is why we need to look carefully at Bill 70 when it's referred to committee, Mr. Chair. This is one of the main roles held by the Procedure Committee of the House to have oversight over these rules. Justice Hogue, in a motion tabled before the House of Commons, asked us to produce a report, an interim report. Why was this asked? Not only to make her work, but it is to quickly as possible and as much as possible learn about this as elections approach. Why is this so urgent? Well, because we are facing a supposed minority government. So as long as the government is a coalition government with the NDP, there will not be an election. But can we know when the NDP intends to withdraw its support from the Liberals? I've heard Liberals say and hope that this never occurs. I have some news for you. When it comes time for the NDP to drop you, they will drop you. No worries. Or rather, perhaps you should be worried because you have risked it all. But those are the facts. We're dealing with a minority government that has the support of the NDP, and that at this time controls or tries to control the agenda of what people will be informed about or not with respect to foreign interference. That is unacceptable. This brings me back to Justice Hogue's interim report. In this report, we learned a number of things. Justice Hogue confirmed what everybody already knew. Yes, there was foreign interference in the last two elections. Justice Hogue confirmed as well that foreign interference did not have any direct result on the overall election outcomes. The Conservatives have said so, everybody has said this. But we specifically learned that the claims of our colleague, Tinishu, that is the Pékin's regime and its 50 years of disinformation had a major impact and possibly decisive impact on the outcome of its last election, which they lost. And this was well-founded. And in fact, there was evidence that demonstrated, yes, that there might have been an impact on the outcome of this election, Mr. Chair. And if Justice Hogue believed that it was appropriate to notify Canadian parliamentarians and the Canadian public with respect to the events prior to releasing her final report, there's a reason for this. She wants to ensure that this not occur again at the next election. And again, she realizes that this election could be called at any time. There's another important and worrisome element. And again, here I don't quite share the opinion of my colleague from the Bloc Québécois, That is the Chinese Communist government's interference. Point of order, Mr. Chair. It's not so much that I was mentioned, but I think we only have a few minutes left. No, in fact, we have more than an hour left because we have found the necessary resources to continue. So, to pursue the work, we need to consult the members. I was not consulted as to the feasibility. No, we don't need to consult. That is the privilege of the chair. Yes, I made my decision 30 minutes ago that we will be continuing. Thank you. Very well, Mr. Berthold. So I was speaking about my colleague. He was inquiring as to the length of this meeting, and I said that our opinions differ because earlier, as she spoke in this committee, she was speaking to my colleague's amendment and the sub-amendment by my colleague on the amendment tabled by the NTB on the Liberals' motion. That is, we should allow Justice Hogue to do her work and allow this interim report to be released without involvement. That is, we knew that Justice Hogue would be focusing on foreign interference. We should let all of this work carry out and allow Justice Hogue to complete her work. But that is not what the House asked for. What the House asked for is for a preliminary report and for a very specific reason. And the idea is to be able to prepare for a next election. And what Justice Hogue revealed, and I was in fact about to raise that, is that apparently that there has been interference by the Beijing Communist regime regarding the nomination of a candidate. In the case of our colleague Han Dong. So apparently the interference perpetrated by the Beijing regime had an impact on the choice of the candidate before he was elected, and Mr. Han Dong apparently took advantage of the support of being a citizen, that he was sworn in, and a citizen was brought there by representatives of the Chinese Communist regime who then voted for Mr. Han Dong. Now, the problem is that this is a riding that is very liberal. Since we have many conservative ridings in the West, and we have some conservative ridings here, we also have by-elections elsewhere, we realize that no doubt the result will be the same. This was a liberal riding. It remains a liberal riding. So why would a regime try to influence a regime in a country to get involved and to interfere in the nomination process of a candidate? Clearly, it's because they want to choose that member. And Justice Hogue raised that issue. But there was something Justice Hogue did not mention. We know that Mr. Dong was informed that CSIS was investigating interference as part of the nomination process during the election of Beijing's communist regime with respect to him. And since this is highly political and highly partisan, it's clear that Justice Hogue is not going to address this. Now, that is the responsibility of PROC. Analyzing the nomination process, how did this unfold, who was made aware. There were people who received that confidential secret information, and this was sent to a candidate to protect the individual. Mr. Chair, that is information indicating that Justice Hogue would not go further in her report. but it is important for us. For Canadian citizens, it is important to know who breached those laws and possibly undermined an investigation by CSIS in order to foster the election of a Liberal candidate in an election. And it's for this reason that my colleague's motion aims at ensuring that we address the issue of foreign interference prior to commencing a new study. And as I mentioned, we were prepared to commence the study. We were prepared to schedule meetings. And this was the outcome of Ms. Romano's motion. Again, last night, we heard this from the Speaker in the House of Commons. He agreed. He told our colleague, Mr. Garnaginius, look, the issue of privilege that you've raised is highly relevant. And in fact, it's a matter of privilege that requires the House of Commons holding a debate, and everything stopped. At the House of Commons, it was instantaneous. The Speaker rendered his decision, and immediately debate started to focus on the issue of privilege. During all of the evening here last night, and we began this morning as well, that is, as long as members continued to want to speak about it until we had unanimous motion for the House to refer this to PROC. My colleague, Mr. Cooper, as soon as this motion was made known, immediately asked this committee to suspend its work so that we could take over. It was immediate last night and as well this morning. And unfortunately, the government, that is, the government MPs, once again assisted by the NDP, wanted to, I don't quite know, I don't follow, I don't understand. I simply don't understand why on the one hand you're unanimous when we're in the House, and on the other hand here, they're voting against the fact that this study should be a priority. Mr. Chair, I'll stop here, but again, I'd like to give you time to go back to your seats because I am not quite done. I'm done. So I'll continue speaking till the chair is back in his seat. So I'll stop shortly.
Je disais que j'arrête là mon intervention. Je vous demande de remettre mon nom à la fin de la liste,
Monsieur
s'il vous plaît.
Berthaud,
Merci.
désolé, merci.
Non, pas de problème.
On a une nouvelle équipe d'interpréteurs pour notre traduction, alors on doit suspendu pour...
We have a
We
new
have a new
team of
interpretation
interpreters
team
coming,
on
so we
site, so we have
to suspend the meeting for a few minutes so that they can get organized. Would you allow me to propose an adjournment motion in a minute? Because if we don't have access to both official languages in this debate, I don't want to continue. So just a moment.
Malheureusement, Monsieur Berthold, je dois...
Unfortunately, I have to suspend the meeting, and we'll continue in a few minutes.
Hey, bienvenue tout le monde.
Welcome back, everyone. Does it work? We have a new interpretation team. Is it working? Okay, great. Mr. Berthold, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome to PROC, by the way. It's great to see that you're settling in. So, Mr. Chair, I have seen that there have been some attempts to discuss the matter between the parties, so I'm going to move that we adjourn debate so that we can talk about it amongst ourselves. Thank you.
Okay, Monsieur Berthaud.
Mr. Berthold, You will probably clarify with no condition. That was a comment, Mr. Chair. I move that the debate on Ms. Romanaudo's motion now be adjourned. Okay, I understand. Thank you.
We, again, will be voting on whether or not to adjourn the motion presented by Madame Romanado. This is the same question that had been dealt with previously. I will now ask the clerk to call the vote.
No.
Mr. Collins.
Nope.
Mr. Duguid.
Nope.
Mr. Turnbull.
Nope.
McDonald.
No.
Mr. Cooper.
Yes.
Mr. Culkins.
Yes.
Mr. Duncan.
Yes.
Mr. Berthold.
Oui.
Mr. Desilets.
No.
Ms. Matheson.
No.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
Okay, colleagues, we have 4 yeas and 7 nays. Monsieur Berthold, est-ce que vous voulez continuer avec la parole?
Mr. Berthold, do you want to keep and continue? If you want me to, I can, but otherwise, did you finish? Okay.
Hawkins, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll just preface my comments by reiterating what I said earlier. I think we have very good options before us as a committee. I don't believe that anybody is presenting any motions in bad faith or bad intent, but I do believe that we have to make the best decision possible as committee members as to what this very busy, very important committee ought to be studying as a matter of priority and triage accordingly. We here on the Conservative side, I think, will continue making that case for as long as it takes, because we believe that foreign interference, which is, I believe, one of what I would consider to be 3 matters that are being discussed, notwithstanding the sub-amendment portion of a debate that we're in. Two of the 3 matters that we could proceed with deal with foreign interference, and in continuation from what happened in the discussion from last Tuesday, we now have a prima facie case on a question of privilege, which always ends up at this committee, has now been unanimously adopted by the House by all political parties. Yet here we are unable to agree that that's the matter that we should be discussing upon the order from the House and or the finding in the House. So my colleague Mr. Cooper, my colleague Mr. Duncan, and my colleague Mr. Berthold have all moved motions to adjourn the current debate on the current motion so that we can proceed to either discussion or pursue discussing another motion to discuss the pressing matter from the House. So I just want to remind colleagues, and we have spent a lot of time talking about foreign interference. We have a public inquiry, yet here we are again with new revelations in the media, with new information about the PRC's continued interference and, frankly, what I would construe to be aggressive behavior towards not only the democratic institutions, such as our federal elections, but now in what I would consider to be personal attacks against members of the House of Commons and Senate. And I presume every member here operates in good conscience and in good faith, but to know that my emails, my personal devices, my iPad, my computer has been the target of a cyber attack, or could have been. So far, we only know of 18. And I'll remind colleagues that when we first started hearing about foreign interference from China, we heard about potential 1 or 2 people that might have been affected in nominations. And then it grew to 11 people that might have been unduly influenced during nomination processes, with funding coming bankrolled by the PRC for multiple political parties, my party included. And now we're up to 18 parliamentarians, members of the House of Commons and Senate. So this doesn't appear to be, and anything that we have started to do doesn't appear to be dissuading the People's Republic of China. And we've been talking about this issue for quite some time. We finally have a piece of legislation dealing with what I would consider to be a portion of the broader conversation about Chinese interference in our institutions. And I think, my opinion would be, and my advice to colleagues would be, given the fact that it is now May, we have 5 more weeks after this week, once we return from the May long weekend break next week. I wish you all safe travels and good health and rest and recuperation. We'll come back for 5 weeks. It will be, as we all know, a challenging and trying time, because the weather will be good and there will be other things that we'd rather go do, and we'll be feisty. And if the last 18 years are any indication of what's going to happen in the next 5 weeks, I can predict that that will be the case. And that's fine. I don't take it personally. I don't think any of us should take these things personally. That's just the adversarial nature of our system. And that's why I'm concerned. I'm not just concerned for the sake of my own colleagues, Mr. Jennis and Mr. Chong or any others. I'm concerned for all of you. You're all my fellow citizens. Well, Mr. Desilets, I'm not trying to impugn anything that you might disagree with that. But while we disagree or have an adversarial system, you're all my fellow citizens. And I want you all to have the same protection and afforded the same ability to carry out your duties. Whether I agree with what you have to say or not, we all have the right to say it without intimidation and without being put in a vulnerable position because we have not done an adequate job as a parliament or as a government to address what is becoming a clear pattern of a clear threat from a clear source. And we have 5 weeks left after the break. We adjourn, then we come back and we at best have 1 full parliamentary cycle. That's all we'll have left, is 1 full parliamentary cycle. Because if we do have an election in October of 2025, if this parliament goes to the end, I doubt we'll be returning in September of next year. We'll go right into the writ period. So we basically have, as a committee, 1 full calendar year plus 5 weeks to study, make recommendations, and have the government respond to those recommendations, hopefully, if necessary, through any legislative changes that might be required, and then pass those laws in both chambers and have royal assent prior to the next election for the betterment of the integrity of our elections and for the betterment of the ability of our agencies to protect us not only as candidates, but also as parliamentarians in the interim. And that's not a long timeline. So really the question, as I see it, is what will our priority be? Is there any bad issue before us? No, all of them are worthy of discussion and consideration, all of them. But which one could we do the most good with, and which one is most important? And I would say issues of significant national interest, in this case, the ruling of the prima facie case of members' privileges